By the time the stopwatch clicked to a halt, the entire row of SEAL instructors had fallen silent. No one spoke. They just stared at the trembling numbers on the display as the woman in the sand nearby tried to lift her head. Sweat streaked down her face, mixing with grit that clung to her skin, yet there was something fierce in her eyes, something that didn't match the disbelief spreading through the crowd. Whatever she had just done, everyone knew it wasn't supposed to be possible. One instructor muttered a curse, another shook the stopwatch as if the device had betrayed him, and someone whispered the question the rest were afraid to voice. How did she do that? Only minutes earlier, none of them imagined she would finish the course at all, let alone threaten a record that had stood untouched for years. That was the part that unsettled them. The result mattered, but the surprise shook them deeper. They prided themselves on recognizing potential instantly, and somehow they had missed hers completely. To understand how a group of elite warriors ended up questioning everything they thought they knew, you'd have to go back to earlier that morning of that day. Sarah arrived at Coronado with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years proving herself in places where no one expected her to last. She wasn't there as a researcher or an outsider with theories. She'd been brought in because too many candidates were washing out with preventable injuries, and the command finally wanted someone who could dissect the problem before another promising trainee ended up sidelined. Her file didn't look impressive at first glance. 5'4", lean, unassuming. But anyone who read beyond the basics found a record that didn't match her frame. She'd run mountain ultramarathons where storms erased entire trails, completed rescue operations that required carrying men twice her size out of canyons, and built a career studying human limits by pushing her own again and again. Still, the moment she stepped onto the base, she felt the familiar shift in the air. The polite glances that lingered a little too long, the assumptions tucked behind half-smiles, the subtle expectation that she was there to take notes rather than lead change. She didn't resent it anymore. She had learned to let underestimation work in her favor. What had bothered her was the pattern she kept seeing across elite programs. Talented candidates breaking down not because they lacked grit, but because something in the training pipeline wasn't keeping pace with modern demands. That was why she accepted this short-term assignment, to understand the fracture points no one else was catching. She moved through the compound quietly that first morning, listening more than she spoke, noting every detail the instructors glossed over. Her motivation wasn't to impress them or challenge them. She simply wanted answers. And yet, beneath that calm purpose, a small part of her wondered how long it would take before someone tested whether she actually belonged there at all. The briefing room smelled faintly of sand and sweat, the kind of air that carried the weight of early morning effort. Sarah stood near the back, arms crossed loosely as she studied the map of the obstacle course pinned to the wall. The instructors were discussing minor layout changes, debating whether the new configuration would reduce the bottlenecks that slowed candidates during peak training cycles. She listened quietly, until one particular detail made her tilt her head. A sequence of power-based obstacles stacked so closely together that even the strongest candidates would fatigue before reaching the endurance portion of the course. Without thinking, she murmured something about how the layout rewarded brute force more than efficient movement, and how that imbalance might be contributing to the rising injury rates. It wasn't a criticism, just an observation spoken aloud, but in a room full of men who'd spent their careers trusting strength over nuance, it landed differently. A few instructors exchanged glances. One smirked. Another raised an eyebrow in a way that suggested she had crossed an invisible line. The light ribbing started almost immediately, wrapped in humor but edged with challenge. Someone joked that analyzing a course wasn't the same as surviving it. Someone else added that efficiency sounded great on paper, but the sand had a way of humbling people who talked a little too confidently about theory. The laughter was easy, harmless on the surface, yet Sarah could feel the room testing her, pushing to see whether she would retreat into silence the way so many outsiders did when their expertise bumped against military pride. She didn't flinch. She simply offered a small smile, the kind that never quite gave away what she was thinking. That was when one of the senior instructors leaned back in his chair and tossed out a line meant to seal the moment. "If you think it's inefficient, why don't you run it yourself?" The room erupted again, louder this time, because everyone understood the joke. She wasn't a candidate. She wasn't even in the training pipeline. Sarah let the laughter fade before she answered. Mind if I give it a try? She asked, her voice steady enough to silence the room far more effectively than any punchline. And in that instant, the teasing turned into something else entirely. A challenge had been issued, and the base was already buzzing with the news. Sarah walked out to the course with the same calm focus she brought to rescue missions. Except this time, she wasn't preparing her body. She was preparing her mind. The sand was cool underfoot, the morning wind cutting across the open field as she stood before the first obstacle and watched how it moved, how trainees moved around it, and how both collided in ways no one else seemed to notice. She approached the course the way an engineer would examine a faulty bridge, crouching near pivot points, running her fingers along metal bars, tracing angles with her eyes until patterns began to reveal themselves. Where others saw a wall to climb, she saw leverage. Where others saw a rope to endure, she saw momentum waiting to be harvested. She whispered timing estimates under her breath, counting breaths between movements, imagining how the body shifted weight when fatigue tried to drag everything downward. When candidates cycled through their practice runs, she asked quiet questions, where they felt their grip fail, where their lungs burned first, where fear crept in unexpectedly. Most answered with a mix of embarrassment and curiosity, uncertain why she cared about details they'd never been taught to articulate. She noted every hesitation, every unnecessary muscle contraction, every wasted second that accumulated like hidden debt. Efficiency wasn't a suggestion to her. It was a discipline, and she treated the course like a series of solvable problems masquerading as physical obstacles. As the hours passed, little clusters of trainees gathered nearby, pretending to stretch while keeping an eye on her. Word traveled fast. The consultant was actually going to run the course. Bets formed quietly at first, and then openly, with most assuming she'd quit halfway or get thrown off by the tower ascent. A few wondered aloud if she'd make it past the first sequence. The laughter wasn't cruel. It was the kind born from certainty. They believed they understood the limits of human performance, and her presence challenged that more than anyone was willing to admit. She ignored all of it. Her world had narrowed to ratios, breath control, and the subtle mathematics of movement. By the time the sun climbed higher and the window until her attempt grew smaller, she had mapped the entire course in her mind. Not through brute force preparation, but through mastery of detail no one else had bothered to see. And somewhere inside that calm concentration, a quiet question pulsed beneath every calculation. Would her understanding be enough to carry her where strength alone had failed so many others? When the horn sounded, Sarah launched herself forward before her mind had the chance to question what her body was committing to. The first obstacle loomed immediately. A horizontal traverse wall studded with uneven grips that forced most candidates into awkward, muscle-draining movements. Instead of reaching for the highest holds like everyone else, she angled low, using momentum from her initial sprint to swing her hips and let her legs counterbalance her weight. Each grip looked precarious, and a few instructors muttered that she'd fall within seconds, yet she moved with a rhythm that seemed almost accidental until they realized it was perfectly calculated. Halfway across, her foot slipped on a sand-coated foothold, drawing a sharp gasp from the watchers, but she tightened her core and swung her weight back into alignment before the slip could turn into a fall. Clearing the wall, she sprinted toward the balance beam gauntlet, a stretch of narrow logs suspended on pivot points that shifted unpredictably with each step. Most candidates tried to freeze their posture and tiptoe across, but Sarah treated the beam like a moving partner, adjusting her cadence to the subtle tilts beneath her feet. The first log dipped hard to the left and nearly threw her, but she bent her knees and used the drop to propel herself forward instead of resisting it. A murmur rippled through the crowd as she transitioned cleanly to the next log, then the next, gaining speed where others slowed. By the time she reached the final beam, even the instructors who had doubted her fell quiet, tracking each movement as if trying to decode a language they had never learned to speak. She hit the ground running and approached the monkey ladder, a long overhead sequence known for draining grip strength in seconds. Instead of muscling her way through, she timed her swings with an almost playful accuracy, letting each forward motion amplify the next. On the fourth bar, her fingers slipped on a patch of moisture left by a previous candidate, and for a moment her body hung in a lopsided arc that made several spectators wince. But she let the slip become part of her momentum, redirecting the swing to hook the next bar with a burst of controlled force that looked less like desperation and more like improvisation under pressure. A few of the younger trainees exchanged bewildered glances. They had never seen someone turn a mistake into acceleration so smoothly. Then came the water trench, a pit of frigid seawater that usually stole a second from even strong candidates. Sarah didn't break. She dove straight in, sliced through the cold, and surged out the far side before most spectators realized she'd entered. The next obstacle rose above the course like a dare no one wanted to accept. A 25-foot overhang climb with a lip that forced every athlete to fight gravity twice, first on the ascent and again when their muscles trembled at the transition. Sarah slowed for the first time, staring up at the jagged structure as if assessing not just its shape, but the quiet threat hidden inside it. The earlier obstacles rewarded timing and precision, but this one demanded raw strength, the very thing everyone assumed she lacked. She gripped the first hold, feeling the rough metal bite into her palms, and pulled herself upward. Within seconds her biceps burned in a way that made doubt slip into her mind, subtle but sharp, reminding her that this was where smaller athletes usually failed. Halfway up, the wind shifted, rattling the frame and forcing her body sideways. She clung to the wall, legs trembling, realizing she didn't have the leverage the larger candidates relied on. Her grip faltered, and for a heartbeat she imagined the fall, sand rushing up, instructors rushing over, the story ending right here. That flash of fear cracked something open inside her, pulling forward an old memory she didn't invite. She was back in the mountains during a rescue op, covered in sleet, holding onto the strap of a man twice her size as he slipped toward a ravine. Her sergeant's voice cut through the storm. "Control the inch in front of you, Martinez. Forget the rest." She'd saved him by following that single line. She returned to the present with a steadier breath. 1 inch, 1 hold, 1 shift of weight. She hugged the wall, drawing power from the smallest muscles she usually ignored, and found a new rhythm, less force, more trust. Inch by inch, her body remembered how to turn fear into focus. When she reached the overhang, the crowd had gone silent, every instructor unknowingly holding his breath. She pressed through the final transition with a strained exhale that carried both pain and defiance. And when she finally pulled herself onto the top platform, a wave of cheers broke out, raw and unfiltered, as if everyone below had suddenly started believing in her at the exact same moment. Sarah descended from the overhang with legs that felt strangely foreign, as if they no longer belonged to her. The moment her boots hit the sand, she knew the course had saved its cruelest demand for last. Ahead lay the final stretch, a sand crawl that emptied the lungs of even the strongest candidates, followed by a rope drag that punished whatever strength remained, and a closing sprint across shifting ground that showed no mercy to tired legs. She dropped to her knees, slid under the low barrier, and pushed forward with the raw determination of someone who'd already given more than she thought she had. Sand filled her sleeves and scraped her elbows, but she refused to slow down, her breath short and rhythmic like she'd practiced in her head hours earlier. As she emerged from the crawl, she reached for the rope, its thick fibers rough against her palms. An instructor shouted the time, sharp, urgent, far too close to the record for comfort. She leaned back, using her body weight instead of her muscles, and dragged the weighted sled with a steady grind that carved lines in the sand. Her shoulders ached, her spine shook under the effort, and her grip threatened to fade. But when another time call rang out, something inside her snapped into focus. She refused to let the moment slip by. Not here. Not now. The sled crossed the marker, and she broke into the final sprint. Her legs screamed, her vision tunneled, and each step felt like it might be the one that collapsed her. But the finish line was there, close enough to taste in the salt of her breath. She hurled herself forward, crossing the line with a desperate final stride before falling into the sand. Silence washed over the crowd. Then the stopwatch clicked, and the instructor's voice cracked as he read the number. She hadn't just beaten the record. She'd obliterated it. The eruption of cheers hit her like a wave. For a moment, Sarah lay perfectly still, listening to her heartbeat pound against the sand while the noise around her slowly sharpened into human voices. Footsteps approached first, the hesitant kind that belonged to men who weren't entirely sure how to face someone they had misjudged so completely. Peterson, one of the most confident candidates, was the first to kneel beside her. He offered his hand, not out of pity, but with the quiet sincerity of someone acknowledging a truth he hadn't been ready to see. "I was wrong," he said simply. "How did you pull that off?" There was no ego left in his tone, only awe. Another instructor followed, then another, each one offering a few words, some apologetic, some curious, some admiring, but all threaded with a respect that hadn't existed an hour earlier. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, legs unsteady, only to find the commanding officer walking toward her with an expression that mixed professionalism with something warmer. He didn't mention her size, her background, or the fact that she was the only woman on the field. Instead, he focused on her choices, how she exploited timing, conserved energy, and treated each obstacle like a solvable equation. "Strength gets a candidate through the first hour," he said. "But your approach? That gets someone through a career." It was the kind of acknowledgement that reshaped the entire narrative, lifting her achievement out of the realm of exception and placing it firmly within the domain of mastery. The instructors who had doubted her earlier now watched her with a different kind of intensity. One of them stepped closer, scratching the back of his neck as he spoke. "We've been teaching the same way for years. Maybe too long. Would you consider walking us through your process?" Their request wasn't ceremonial. It was an invitation into a tribe that chose its members based on merit, not assumption. And as Sarah nodded, a quiet satisfaction settled over her. Respect wasn't something you demanded in a place like this. It was something you earned, one undeniable action at a time.